"That's the wrong formula," whispered the janitor's daughter. "And save us $300 million contract, what the CEO did next changed everything." Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The fluorescent lights of Sterling Dynamics hummed their familiar tune as Frank Thompson pushed his cleaning cart down the marble corridors at 11:47 p.m. For 15 years, these halls had been his second home. Every stain, every scuff mark, every corner held a memory. But tonight was different. Tonight, his 7-year-old daughter Emma was with him. "Daddy, why do you have to work so late?" Emma asked, her golden curls bouncing as she skipped alongside the cart. Her bright blue eyes reflected the harsh hallway lighting, making her look almost ethereal in the empty corporate building. "Well, sweetheart," Frank said, adjusting his worn Sterling Dynamics uniform, "someone's got to keep this place clean for all the important people who work here during the day. And Mrs. Patterson is sick tonight, so I had to bring you along." Emma nodded solemnly, as if she understood the weight of responsibility that came with keeping a multi-billion-dollar company spotless. She'd been here before. Frank's ex-wife had disappeared 3 years ago, leaving him to raise Emma alone on a janitor's salary. Sometimes when his babysitter cancelled, Emma became his tiny night shift companion. They entered the executive conference room on the 42nd floor, where CEO Richard Sterling had held his emergency board meeting earlier that day. Frank had overheard snippets of heated conversation through the thick oak doors, something about a critical formula error and a $300 million contract hanging by a thread. "Oh, look at all these papers," Emma exclaimed, climbing onto one of the leather chairs. The massive mahogany table was covered with documents, laptops and whiteboards, covered in complex mathematical equations. "Don't touch anything, Em," Frank warned, spraying glass cleaner on the floor-to-ceiling windows. "These people are way smarter than us. This is rocket science stuff." But Emma was already studying the whiteboard closest to her, her small finger tracing the numbers and symbols. Frank had noticed this habit of hers. She was always drawn to patterns, numbers, puzzles. Her second-grade teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had mentioned Emma was exceptionally bright in mathematics, but Frank figured all parents heard that. "Daddy," Emma said softly, her voice carrying a strange certainty that made Frank pause mid-spray. "This formula is wrong." Frank chuckled. "Honey, these are some of the smartest people in the world. Dr. Chen has 3 PhDs from MIT. I don't think—" "No, Daddy, look." Emma pointed to a series of calculations in the middle of the board. "If x equals 47.3 and you multiply it by the coefficient here, the answer should be 2,347.39, not 2,874. 39. They switched the numbers." Frank dropped his spray bottle. It clattered against the marble floor, the sound echoing through the silent room like a gunshot. He stared at his daughter, this little girl in her pink pajamas and tiny sneakers, pointing at equations that might as well have been hieroglyphics to him. "Emma, baby, how do you know that?" I can see it, Daddy. Like when you show me a picture that's upside down, and I know it's upside down. The numbers are in the wrong places." Frank felt his heart hammering against his ribs. The fragments of conversation he'd overheard suddenly crashed together in his mind. Formula error. 300 million. Contract hanging by a thread. What if Emma was right? What if his 7-year-old daughter had just spotted the mistake that was about to cost Sterling Dynamics the biggest deal in company history? He looked at the whiteboard again, then at Emma, then at the stack of contracts marked "Urgent deadline tomorrow 9 a.m. in Richard Sterling's distinctive handwriting. Frank Thompson had spent 15 years invisible in these halls, emptying trash cans and mopping floors while billion-dollar decisions were made around him. He'd never spoken to the CEO beyond a polite nod. He barely had a high school diploma. But his daughter, his brilliant, inexplicable daughter, might have just seen something that MIT PhDs had missed. The question that would haunt him until morning was simple. What do you do when your 7-year-old might be the smartest person in the building? The digital clock on the conference room wall clicked to 11:58 p.m. In exactly 9 hours and 2 minutes, Richard Sterling would walk into a boardroom and potentially sign away the future of his company. Unless Frank Thompson found the courage to do something he'd never done in his entire life, speak up. Frank stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror at 3:17 a.m., his weathered hands gripping the porcelain sink until his knuckles turned white. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting shadows that danced across his tired face like ghosts of doubt. Emma slept peacefully in the employee break room, curled up on the old couch with his jacket as a blanket, her golden hair spilling across the worn fabric like sunlight on faded leather. The conference room whiteboard haunted his thoughts, those numbers Emma had pointed to with such innocent certainty. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see her small finger tracing the equations, hear her voice saying, "The numbers are in the wrong places," with the calm authority of someone who simply knew truth when she saw it. "You're losing your mind, Frank," he whispered to himself, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. "She's 7 years old." 7-year-olds don't solve MIT-level mathematics. But even as he spoke the words, memories flooded back. Emma at 4, counting the tiles on their kitchen floor and announcing there were exactly 247, but it should be 248 to make a perfect rectangle. Emma at 5, correcting the grocery store cashier who had overcharged them by 37 cents. Emma at 6, arranging her birthday candles in prime number sequences because it looks more balanced that way, Daddy. He'd attributed it all to natural intelligence, the kind of brightness every proud father sees in his child. But this was different. This wasn't a child being clever. This was a child seeing mathematical truth with the clarity of someone born to understand numbers the way others understand language. Frank splashed cold water on his face and returned to the conference room. He stood before the whiteboard like a pilgrim approaching a shrine, those equations swimming before his eyes, meaningless symbols and numbers that might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphics. But Emma's words echoed in his mind. If x equals 47, 3, and you multiply it by the coefficient here. No, his hands trembling, he pulled out his phone and opened the calculator app. The screen seemed impossibly bright in the darkened room as he typed 47, 3x 60, 2. His finger hovered over the equals button for what felt like an eternity. This moment would change everything, either confirm his daughter's impossible gift or prove he was a desperate father seeing miracles where none existed. The result appeared, 2,947, 46. Frank's legs nearly gave out. His 7-year-old daughter's mental calculation had been off by mere hundredths, close enough to make his heart pound against his ribs like a caged bird. The whiteboard showed 2,174, 39. A transposition error, a simple, devastating mistake that could cost Sterling Dynamics $300 million. He sank into one of the leather conference chairs, the weight of realization crushing down on him like an avalanche. Emma hadn't just spotted an error. She had potentially saved the company that employed him, the company that had provided their modest but steady income for 15 years. The company whose executives walked these halls making decisions that affected thousands of lives, while he emptied their trash cans and mopped their floors in invisible silence. The digital clock on the wall read 4:23 a.m. In exactly 4 hours and 37 minutes, Richard Sterling would arrive at his office to prepare for the most important presentation of his career. In 6 hours, the Meridian Defense representatives would gather in this very room to hear Sterling Dynamics' proposal for a satellite launch system worth more than Frank would earn in 20 lifetimes. Frank looked at his daughter, sleeping peacefully on the couch, unaware that her casual observation had revealed a truth that MIT PhDs had missed. The question that had tormented him all night suddenly crystallized into perfect clarity. He had no choice. He had to tell Sterling. At 5:30 a.m., as the first pale light of dawn crept through the conference room windows, Frank Thompson made the most terrifying decision of his life. He was going to speak to Richard Sterling, not as an employee to his boss, but as a father protecting his child's future and a man preventing a catastrophe. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like ascending to meet his fate. The executive floor of Sterling Dynamics existed in a different universe from the maintenance levels Frank knew so well. Here, the marble floors gleamed like mirrors. The mahogany panels whispered of old money and older power, and the very air seemed to hum with the electricity of important decisions. Frank's work boots, so familiar on concrete floors and service elevators, felt alien against the polished stone as he approached the corner office where light already glowed behind frosted glass doors. Richard Sterling was legendary for arriving before dawn and leaving after midnight, a work ethic that had built Sterling Dynamics from a struggling aerospace startup into a global defense contractor worth billions. The man's reputation preceded him into every room, brilliant, ruthless, uncompromising, and utterly dedicated to excellence. Frank had glimpsed him perhaps a dozen times in 15 years, always from a distance, always surrounded by executives in expensive suits, discussing matters Frank couldn't begin to comprehend. Now he was going to knock on that door and claim his 7-year-old daughter was smarter than Sterling's entire engineering team. Frank's hand shook as he knocked. The sound seemed to echo through the hallway like thunder. "Come in," came the authoritative voice that had commanded boardrooms for 2 decades, the voice that had negotiated contracts with the Pentagon and made Sterling Dynamics synonymous with precision engineering. Richard Sterling looked up from his computer screen, his silver hair perfectly styled, despite the early hour. At 42, he was the youngest CEO in Sterling Dynamics history, having earned his position through a combination of technical brilliance and business acumen that industry magazines called supernatural. His sharp blue eyes registered surprise, then mild annoyance at the interruption. "Frank, isn't it? Is there a problem with the cleaning?" Sterling's voice carried the practiced politeness of a man accustomed to efficiency in all things. Frank's mouth went completely dry. In 15 years of employment, Sterling had never remembered his name. The fact that he did now felt both miraculous and terrifying. "Mr. Sterling, sir, I need to talk to you about the Meridian contract." The change in Sterling's expression was immediate and dramatic. His eyebrows rose, his posture straightened, and suddenly Frank felt the full weight of one of America's most powerful CEOs' attention focused on him like a laser. "I'm sorry. What did you just say?" "The formula, sir. On the whiteboard in conference room A, there's an error in the calculations." Frank's voice sounded foreign to his own ears, as if someone else was speaking through him. Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, studying Frank with the intensity of a hawk examining prey. The silence stretched between them, filled with the soft hum of computers and the distant sound of early morning traffic 42 floors below. "You're telling me," Sterling said slowly, "that there's an error in calculations that have been reviewed by our top engineering team. Calculations overseen by Dr. Patricia Chen, who has 3 PhDs from MIT and 15 years of aerospace experience." Frank felt sweat beading on his forehead. "Yes, sir. My daughter spotted it last night while I was cleaning." "Your daughter?" Sterling's voice carried a note of incredulity that made Frank want to disappear into the floor. "How old is your daughter, Frank?" 7, sir." The silence that followed was so complete that Frank could hear his own heartbeat. Sterling's face cycled through disbelief, amusement, and something Frank couldn't identify. something that looked almost like hunger. Finally, Sterling stood, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Show me." They walked to conference room A in absolute silence, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. Frank felt like a condemned man walking to the gallows, each step bringing him closer to either vindication or professional suicide. If he was wrong, he'd be fired on the spot. If he was right, he honestly didn't know what would happen if he was right. Emma was awake when they entered, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the couch, arranging Sterling Dynamics paperclips into complex geometric patterns. She looked up as they entered, her blue eyes bright and curious, completely unaware of the storm of tension surrounding the two adults. "This is Emma," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sterling knelt down to Emma's eye level, and for a moment his corporate facade softened. "Hello, Emma. Your daddy tells me you found a mistake in our math." Emma nodded solemnly, her small face serious with the weight of adult attention. She pointed to the whiteboard with the confidence of a teacher addressing her class. "The numbers got switched around. See? 47. 3 times 60. 2 is not 2,874. 39. It's 2,847. 39. Someone wrote the 4 and the 7 in the wrong places." Sterling rose slowly, his eyes fixed on the equation with laser focus. He pulled out his phone, fingers flying across the calculator with the practiced speed of someone who lived and breathed numbers. Frank held his breath, watching Sterling's face for any sign of what verdict was coming. "Son of a—" Sterling caught himself, glancing at Emma. "You're absolutely right." The words hit Frank like a lightning bolt, simultaneously validating his faith in his daughter and opening a door to possibilities he couldn't begin to imagine. Emma had done the impossible. She had looked at equations that had stumped MIT PhDs and seen the truth with the clarity of pure mathematical intuition. But Sterling's next words changed everything, injecting a note of urgency that made Frank's stomach clench with new worry. "We need to verify this immediately. If this error has propagated through the entire calculation chain." He paused, his face growing pale as the implications sank in. "Frank, your daughter may have just prevented the biggest disaster in company history." By 7:30 a.m., Conference Room A had transformed from a quiet sanctuary into a war room buzzing with frantic energy. "Doctor." Patricia Chen hunched over her laptop, her usually perfect composure shattered as she worked through calculations with 3 other senior engineers. Their faces were masks of concentration and growing horror as they traced the error through spreadsheet after spreadsheet. Emma sat in Richard Sterling's chair at the head of the massive mahogany table, her legs swinging freely as she watched the adults scramble to verify what she had seen in mere seconds. "The error cascades through the entire propulsion model," Dr. Chen announced, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. She looked up from her screen, her face pale with the realization of what they had almost done. "If we had presented these numbers to Meridian Defense, our rocket trajectory calculations would have been off by a factor of 12,000 meters. 12,000 meters, Richard. Our satellites would have fallen short of orbital insertion by nearly 8 miles. Frank felt the blood drain from his face as the magnitude of Emma's discovery hit him like a physical blow. 12,000 meters. The difference between a successful satellite launch that would cement Sterling Dynamics' reputation as America's premier aerospace contractor and a catastrophic failure that would have destroyed the company's credibility forever. He thought about the Challenger disaster, the Columbia tragedy, how single mistakes in complex systems could lead to devastation that echoed through history. "How the hell did we miss this?" Sterling demanded, his legendary composure cracking for the first time Frank had ever witnessed. The billionaire CEO looked haggard, older than his 42 years, as the weight of near disaster settled on his shoulders. "We've been working 18-hour days for 6 weeks straight," Dr. Chen replied. rubbing her temples as if trying to massage away the memory of their oversight. Everyone's exhausted. We've been checking and rechecking calculations until they all started to blur together. Sometimes the simplest errors are the hardest to catch because we're looking for complex problems. She turned to look at Emma with something approaching religious awe. Fresh eyes see what tired eyes miss, and some eyes. She paused, studying Emma as if seeing her for the first time. Some eyes see patterns the rest of us can't even perceive. Sterling's phone buzzed with the aggressive tone he reserved for emergency contacts. He glanced at the screen, and his face tightened further. That's Meridian. They're expecting our presentation in 90 minutes. The entire board of directors is flying in from Seattle. Senator Harrison is personally attending because this contract could create 5,000 jobs in his district. He ran his hands through his silver hair, disturbing its perfect styling for the first time anyone could remember. We'll have to postpone. Recalculate everything from the ground up. It'll take weeks. No, Emma said quietly, her small voice cutting through the adult panic like a bell through fog. Every person in the room turned to stare at her. Dr. Chen paused mid-keystroke. Sterling stopped pacing, and even the junior engineers looked up from their frantic calculations. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Sterling asked, kneeling beside Emma's chair with the gentle tone of someone addressing an oracle. Emma pointed to the massive projection screen showing the corrected spreadsheet. "You don't have to recalculate everything. The mistake only affects 3 calculation chains. Just fix the formula and propagate the correction through columns D, F, and H. All the rest of the math is perfect." She traced patterns in the air as if following invisible mathematical threads. "These numbers here and here and here need to change. But the orbital mechanics, the fuel calculations, the launch window computations, they're all exactly right." Dr. Chen's fingers flew over her keyboard with renewed energy, following Emma's guidance through the labyrinthine spreadsheet. Mathematical formulas flowed across the screen like digital waterfalls, each correction rippling through dependent calculations with perfect precision. "She's absolutely right again," Dr. Chen breathed, her voice filled with wonder. "The core engineering is sound. It's just the propagation error from that single transposed number. We can implement these corrections and have clean calculations in 30 minutes. Sterling sat down heavily in the chair beside Emma, staring at her with an expression Frank couldn't read. Part amazement, part something deeper and more calculating. 30 minutes to fix a mistake that would have cost us $300 million and destroyed our reputation. He shook his head slowly, like a man witnessing a miracle. "Emma, do you understand what you've done?" Emma shrugged with the casual indifference of childhood, completely unaware that she had just altered the trajectory of a multinational corporation. "I helped fix the broken math?" "You saved our company," Sterling said softly, his voice carrying a weight of gratitude and something else, something that made Frank's paternal instincts whisper warnings he couldn't yet articulate. 45 minutes later, Dr. Chen printed the corrected presentation materials. The Meridian contract would be signed that afternoon, cementing Sterling Dynamics' position as America's premier satellite launch contractor. Senator Harrison would announce 5,000 new jobs. The company's stock price would soar. But as Frank watched Sterling looking at Emma with increasing fascination, studying her like a puzzle to be solved, a resource to be developed, a new worry began to gnaw at his chest. What did a billionaire CEO want with a 7-year-old genius? And more importantly for Frank's peace of mind, what would it cost to find out? 3 days after Emma saved the Meridian contract, Frank found himself sitting in Sterling's corner office again, but this time he had been summoned. The view from the 42nd floor was breathtaking. Manhattan spread out below like a circuit board of dreams and ambition. Central Park, a green oasis amid the concrete and steel canyons. Emma sat beside him in a chair that dwarfed her small frame, quietly working through a mathematics workbook that Sterling's assistant had somehow produced within minutes of their arrival. A workbook designed for high school students that Emma was completing with the casual ease of someone reading a picture book. "Frank, I've been thinking about our situation," Sterling began, his tone measured and professional, but his eyes holding an intensity that made Frank's stomach tighten with apprehension. "Emma has demonstrated remarkable mathematical intuition. Gifts like hers, true mathematical genius, appear perhaps once in a generation. They shouldn't be wasted in overcrowded public schools where teachers struggle to challenge even normally gifted students." Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair, acutely aware of his maintenance uniform in this temple of corporate power. He'd been dreading this conversation since watching Sterling's face light up with possibility 3 days ago, since seeing the calculating gleam in the CEO's eyes as he studied Emma like a rare specimen. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Sterling?" "I want to arrange for Emma's education," Sterling said, leaning forward with the enthusiasm of a man who had identified a promising investment. "Private tutors specializing in advanced mathematics and sciences. Accelerated programs that will challenge her intellect rather than bore her into mediocrity. Eventually, admission to the finest universities in the country, MIT, Harvard, Stanford, Caltech. Anywhere she wants to go, any program she wants to pursue." Sterling's eyes gleamed with vision. "I'm talking about a full scholarship, Frank. Everything paid for. Tuition, room and board, research opportunities, study abroad programs. She could have access to resources that most families couldn't afford in 10 lifetimes. The offer hung in the air, like incense, sweet and intoxicating and somehow dangerous." Frank looked at Emma, who had stopped working on her mathematics problems and was listening intently, despite pretending to focus on her workbook. Her small face was serious, processing the implications with the same analytical intensity she brought to equations. That's incredibly generous, sir, but I don't understand why you would—" "There's more," Sterling interrupted, his voice taking on the tone of a man accustomed to making grand gestures. "I want to offer you a position in our facilities management department. Better hours, no more night shifts, better pay, triple your current salary to start with performance bonuses and full medical benefits. You'd oversee maintenance operations during normal business hours, work with professional contractors, manage a real budget. You'd never have to push a mop cart again, Frank. You'd be supervising the people who do." Frank felt the walls of the office closing in around him, his breathing becoming shallow as the magnitude of the offer sank in. Everything he had ever dreamed of for Emma, the best education, unlimited opportunities, freedom from the financial constraints that had defined their lives, was being offered on a silver platter. And for himself, dignity, respect, the chance to provide for his daughter without working himself into an early grave. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this for us? We're nobody. I'm a janitor. Emma's just a kid." Sterling was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the window overlooking Manhattan's glittering expanse. When he spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that Frank had never heard from the legendary CEO. "Because genius shouldn't be limited by circumstance, Frank. Emma has a gift that could change the world, could solve problems we haven't even imagined yet. But also," he paused, something deeply personal flickering across his features, "because I know what it's like to be underestimated, to have potential that no one recognizes. Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, I don't think you've ever been underestimated in your life. You're Richard Sterling. You built this empire from nothing." Sterling laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only the bitter echo of old pain. "Frank, what do you really know about my background? Beyond the corporate biography and the Forbes profiles? Just what everyone knows. You built this company from a startup, became the youngest CEO in aerospace history, made billions through innovation and determination. That's the story we tell investors and journalists, Sterling said quietly, his mask of corporate invincibility slipping to reveal something raw underneath. But that's not where I started. That's not who I was before I became who I am now. He looked directly at Frank, and for the first time, the billionaire CEO seemed almost ordinary, human, vulnerable. I grew up in foster care, Frank, bounced between homes from the time I was 3 until I aged out at 18. No family, no connections, no money, no one who believed I was anything more than another throwaway kid destined for minimum wage and broken dreams. Frank stared at him, speechless. The revelation recontextualized everything he thought he knew about Richard Sterling, the confidence, the drive, the ruthless pursuit of success. I was a janitor too, Sterling continued, his voice growing softer, more reflective. Cleaned office buildings in Boston while I put myself through community college one night class at a time. Worked from midnight to 8 a.m., attended classes from 9 to noon, studied until I passed out, then got up and did it all again. Just like you're doing now, Frank. The only difference is I never had anyone believe in me the way I want to believe in Emma. The revelation hit Frank like a physical blow, reframing everything he thought he understood about their situation. Richard Sterling, billionaire, genius, corporate titan, had walked the exact same path Frank was walking now. Had pushed the same carts, mopped the same floors, felt the same bone-deep exhaustion that came from working nights and dreaming of something better for the people you loved. But as the shock faded and the implications settled into Frank's mind, a new question emerged, one that would keep him awake for the next week, staring at the ceiling of their small Queens apartment, while Emma slept peacefully beside him. If Sterling had climbed out of poverty and obscurity to build an empire, what was he really offering Emma? Salvation or something else entirely? And what would he expect in return? 2 weeks had passed since Sterling's life-changing offer, and Frank still hadn't given him an answer. The decision hung over him like a sword, magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Emma continued her nightly visits to Sterling Dynamics, partly because Frank's babysitter had moved to New Jersey, but increasingly because Sterling had begun leaving increasingly complex mathematical puzzles for her to solve. Each night, Frank would find new workbooks, geometric construction sets, even university-level textbooks waiting for Emma in conference room A. And each morning, Sterling would review her completed work with the intensity of a professor examining a doctoral thesis. Tonight felt different from the moment they stepped off the elevator. Sterling was waiting for them in conference room A as usual, but he wasn't alone. A woman in her 50s sat beside him, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun that spoke of quiet dignity rather than corporate power. Her eyes were the same piercing blue as Sterling's, but where his held the sharp focus of a predator, hers carried the softer warmth of someone who had known real loss and found peace with it. "Frank, Emma, I'd like you to meet someone very special to me," Sterling said, rising from his chair with unusual formality. His voice carried an emotional weight Frank had never heard before, a vulnerability that made the powerful CEO seem almost fragile. "This is Margaret Sterling, my mother." Frank's world tilted on its axis. "Your mother? But you said you grew up in foster care, that you never knew your family." Margaret Sterling smiled with the bittersweet expression of someone who had made peace with difficult truths. Frank could see where Richard had inherited his intensity, but in her it was tempered by something softer, regret perhaps, or hard-won wisdom. "That's true, Frank. I gave Richard up when he was 3 years old." Her voice carried decades of pain, carefully managed but never fully healed. I was 17, unmarried, with no family support and no money. I was working 2 minimum-wage jobs just to afford a single room in a boarding house that wasn't fit for raising a child. I thought I was giving him a better chance at life. Frank felt Emma's small hand slip into his, her intuitive understanding of adult emotion making her reach for comfort in the face of such raw honesty. Sterling sat down heavily, the weight of his own history visible in the slump of his shoulders. "Mom spent 35 years trying to find me," Sterling explained, his voice thick with emotion. "The adoption agency had closed, records were sealed, the foster system lost track of me when I aged out. She never stopped looking, never stopped wondering if she'd made the right choice." He looked at Frank with eyes that held decades of understanding about the weight of parental decisions. "When she finally found me 3 years ago, I was already CEO of Sterling Dynamics. She'd been working as a night shift cleaner in Boston, putting herself through nursing school 1 class at a time while raising 2 other children she'd had later." The parallel to Frank's situation hung in the air like a revelation. "Just like you, she never stopped fighting for a better life, never stopped believing that education and hard work could change everything." Margaret reached for Emma's free hand, her touch gentle but firm. "Richard told me about your daughter's gift, Frank, and about your struggles as a single parent, trying to provide opportunities that feel impossibly out of reach. When I look at you, I see myself 35 years ago, desperate to do right by your child, terrified of making the wrong choice, carrying the weight of their entire future on your shoulders." Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "And when I see Emma, I see Richard at that age, brilliant, curious, capable of extraordinary things, but dependent on adults to recognize and nurture that potential." "I don't understand what you're saying," Frank said, though part of him was beginning to grasp the shape of something larger than Sterling's original offer. "When I found Richard after all those years of searching, I made him promise me something," Margaret continued, her grip on Emma's hand tightening slightly. "That he would never let another child's potential be wasted because of circumstance, that he would be the person I wished had been there for me when I was young and desperate and making impossible choices with no good options." She looked around the conference room, taking in the whiteboards covered with Emma's mathematical work, the textbooks scattered across the table. Every scholarship program Sterling Dynamics sponsors, every inner-city educational outreach initiative, every mentorship program for underprivileged students, it all comes back to that promise. "But Emma," she paused, studying the little girl with wonder. "Emma is special even among the special ones. She could be the next Einstein, the next Marie Curie, the next person who changes how we understand the universe. But only if she gets the right opportunities at the right time." Frank felt tears building behind his eyes as the full scope of what was being offered became clear. "And you're offering those opportunities." "We're offering more than opportunities," Sterling said quietly, his corporate facade completely dissolved in the presence of his mother and the weight of their shared history. "We're offering family, Frank. Real family. The kind that doesn't abandon children when things get difficult, that doesn't let bureaucracy and circumstance determine a child's future." The word family hung in the air like a prayer, simultaneously wonderful and terrifying. Frank looked at Emma, who was staring at Margaret with the wonder of a child meeting a fairy godmother, her mathematical mind perhaps calculating possibilities that Frank couldn't even imagine. Then he looked at Sterling, the man who had everything, who had built an empire from nothing, who could have any life he wanted but was choosing to extend his hand to a janitor and his extraordinary daughter. "Why us?" Frank whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "Really, why us?" Sterling's answer came without hesitation, carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Because 15 years ago, you could have been me, trapped by circumstance but refusing to give up hope. And 7 years ago, Emma could have been lost forever, Just like I almost was. But she doesn't have to be, Frank. None of us have to repeat the mistakes of the past. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears and fierce determination. Frank, I spent 35 years wondering if I'd made the right choice giving Richard up. Wondering what kind of man he would become, wondering if I'd destroyed both our lives by trying to save his. I don't want you to spend the next 35 years wondering if you made the right choice about Emma's future. Some decisions define entire lifetimes. This is one of them. As Frank sat in the conference room, surrounded by the mathematical equations that had started this incredible journey and the weight of decisions that would shape his daughter's destiny, he realized that the most important calculation of his life had nothing to do with numbers or formulas. It was about trust, sacrifice, and the terrifying leap of faith required to accept help from strangers who somehow felt like the family he'd never known he was looking for. But even as his heart opened to the possibility of everything he'd ever dreamed for Emma, his instincts whispered warnings he couldn't yet articulate. There was something else in Sterling's eyes when he looked at Emma, something beyond paternal care or educational opportunity, something that made Frank's protective instincts hum with unease. What did Richard Sterling really want from Emma? And was Frank about to make the best decision of his life, or surrender his daughter to something he didn't fully understand? Frank signed the papers on a Tuesday morning in Sterling's office, his hand trembling slightly as he wrote his name on documents that would transform their lives forever. Emma would begin her accelerated education program immediately, working with private tutors Sterling had personally selected, former MIT professors, NASA engineers, mathematical prodigies who had revolutionized their fields. Frank would start his new position as facilities operations manager the following week, with a salary that seemed impossible after 15 years of survival wages. "Welcome to the Sterling family," Margaret said, embracing Frank with genuine warmth. But even as he felt the relief of security washing over him, something nagged at his consciousness, a detail that didn't quite fit the perfect picture being painted. It was Emma who first voiced what Frank couldn't articulate. As they toured the private education wing Sterling had constructed, specifically for her, a suite of rooms filled with advanced mathematical equipment, computers powerful enough to run complex simulations, and libraries containing texts that most universities couldn't afford, she turned to Frank with unusual seriousness. "Daddy, why are there cameras in all the rooms?" Frank looked around, suddenly noticing the small black devices mounted discreetly in every corner. "Security, sweetheart. This is expensive equipment." But Sterling's response made Frank's stomach clench with unease. "Actually, Emma, they're not just for security. We want to document your progress, study your problem-solving methods. Your mind works differently than other people's. Understanding how you process information could help us develop better teaching methods for other gifted children." The word study hung in the air like a warning bell. Frank found himself looking at Emma differently. Not as his daughter in a wonderful educational program, but as a subject being observed. That night, as they ate dinner in their new company-provided apartment, luxury beyond Frank's wildest dreams, Emma asked questions that revealed the depth of her understanding. "Are they going to watch me all the time, even when I'm thinking?" Her blue eyes held a maturity that reminded Frank she was far more perceptive than her 7 years suggested. "It's just while you're learning, baby, to help you get the best education possible." But Frank's reassurances felt hollow even to himself. That night, he called his sister in California, the first time he'd spoken to family in months. "Katie, I think I might have made a mistake." "What kind of mistake could involve a billionaire giving you everything you've ever wanted?" Frank stared out at the Manhattan skyline from their new 20th floor apartment. Emma's mathematical diagrams scattered across the dining table like evidence of her extraordinary mind. The kind where you realize the cage is made of gold, but it's still a cage. The next morning brought their first real indication that Sterling's interest in Emma went beyond simple educational philanthropy. Dr. Miranda Foster arrived at their apartment at 7 a.m. sharp, a neurological specialist who wanted to conduct baseline cognitive assessments to better understand Emma's capabilities. "It's completely non-invasive," Dr. Foster explained, unpacking equipment that looked more appropriate for a research laboratory than an educational program. "We'll just be monitoring her brain activity while she solves various mathematical problems. This will help us tailor her education to maximize her potential." Frank watched through a one-way window as electrodes were attached to Emma's scalp, as her brain waves appeared on multiple monitors while she worked through increasingly complex equations. The 7-year-old solved problems that should have challenged graduate students, her mind processing mathematical relationships with an ease that defied explanation. But it was the conversation he overheard between Dr. Foster and Sterling that made Frank's blood run cold. "Her neural pathways are unlike anything I've documented. The mathematical processing centers show activity patterns I've never seen. If we could understand the mechanism behind her intuitive calculations, replicate it somehow." Frank realized with growing horror that Emma wasn't being educated. She was being studied, analyzed, reverse-engineered like a machine whose workings Sterling wanted to understand and exploit. That evening, as Emma completed homework assignments that would challenge college professors, Frank made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. He was going to find out what Richard Sterling really wanted with his daughter. Emma's transformation over the following weeks was both miraculous and terrifying. Under the guidance of Sterling's hand-picked tutors, she mastered calculus concepts in days, absorbed quantum mechanics principles with the ease of someone reading fairy tales, and began generating original mathematical proofs that her professors admitted they couldn't fully comprehend. She was becoming everything Sterling had promised, a genuine prodigy whose capabilities seemed to expand exponentially with each passing day. But Frank noticed other changes too. Emma's spontaneous laughter became rarer. Her natural curiosity about everyday things, butterflies, playground games, cartoon shows, faded as her mind became increasingly focused on abstract mathematical concepts. She spent hours staring at equations with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural for a child, as if she were being pulled deeper into a world of pure logic that had no room for childhood wonder. "She's adjusting beautifully," Dr. Foster reported during one of their weekly assessments. "Her cognitive development is accelerating beyond our most optimistic projections. We're documenting learning patterns that could revolutionize our understanding of human intelligence." Frank watched Emma through the observation window, noting how she solved complex differential equations while her EEG readings were recorded, analyzed, and stored in Sterling's vast database. Each session lasted longer than the previous one. Each test pushed further into uncharted territory of mathematical complexity. "What happens to the data you're collecting?" Frank asked Dr. Foster. "It's being compiled into a comprehensive analysis of mathematical genius. Mr. Sterling believes understanding Emma's cognitive processes could lead to breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, educational methodology, even neurological medicine." The clinical language made Frank's skin crawl. They weren't talking about his daughter's education anymore. They were discussing her as a research subject, a source of data to be mined and analyzed. That night, Frank made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. He was going to access Sterling's private files. His new position as facilities operations manager gave him after-hours access to most of the building, including the executive floors. If Sterling was hiding something about his intentions for Emma, Frank was going to find out what it was. At 2 a.m., Frank used his keycard to enter Sterling's office. The space felt different in the darkness, less like a CEO's workspace and more like a shrine to ambition. He moved carefully to Sterling's computer, where Emma's mathematical work was displayed on multiple monitors like some kind of digital art installation. What Frank found in Sterling's private files shattered every assumption he'd made about their benefactor's motivations. Hidden beneath layers of encrypted folders was a project designation that made his blood freeze. Project Mathematical Savant, Cognitive Replication Initiative. The documents revealed Sterling's true purpose with chilling clarity. Emma wasn't being educated, she was being reverse engineered. Every brain scan, every recorded problem-solving session, every interaction with her tutors was being fed into advanced computer algorithms designed to replicate her mathematical intuition artificially. Sterling wasn't interested in Emma's future. He was interested in Emma's mind, and once he understood how it worked, once his team of neuroscientists and AI specialists had mapped every neural pathway that gave her mathematical genius, Emma herself would become expendable. Frank's hands shook as he read deeper into the files. Sterling Dynamics had contracts with the Department of Defense worth billions of dollars, contracts that required mathematical modeling capabilities beyond anything current technology could provide. Emma's brain was the key to creating artificial intelligence systems that could revolutionize everything from missile guidance to satellite navigation. The final document in the folder was a timeline. Phase 1, Education and Assessment, completed. Phase 2, Deep Neural Mapping, currently in progress. Phase 3, Cognitive Pattern Extraction, scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. Phase 4, Subject Retirement, timeline dependent on data extraction success. Frank stared at the screen in horror. Subject retirement. They were planning to dispose of Emma once they had extracted everything they needed from her mind. He had been so desperate to give his daughter opportunities that he had essentially sold her to a monster who saw her not as a child, but as a biological computer, to be decoded and discarded. Frank realized with crystal clarity that he had approximately 6 weeks to save Emma's life. The question that would determine their survival was simple. How do you steal a child back from one of the most powerful men in America? Frank spent the next week in a state of controlled panic, maintaining the facade of grateful employee while desperately planning their escape. Every morning, he walked Emma to her tutoring sessions with a smile that felt like glass cutting his face. Every evening, he helped her with homework assignments that were actually data collection exercises designed to map the neural pathways of her mathematical genius. The worst part was watching Emma herself begin to change in ways that went beyond mere intellectual development. She had always been a bright, curious child who happened to be exceptionally good with numbers. Now, she was becoming something else, a calculating machine wrapped in the body of a 7-year-old girl. "Daddy, why do people waste time on emotions when logic is so much more efficient?" Emma asked one evening as they ate dinner in their luxurious apartment. The question came out of nowhere, delivered with the detached curiosity of someone studying an interesting but irrelevant phenomenon. Frank's fork froze halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Dr. Foster says emotions interfere with optimal cognitive function. She showed me brain scans where emotional responses cause decreased mathematical processing speed. Emma tilted her head with an expression that reminded Frank uncomfortably of how Sterling studied problems. "I've been practicing suppressing emotional reactions to improve my calculation accuracy. It's working very well." Madam, the casual way Emma discussed suppressing her own emotions as if feelings were unnecessary software slowing down her mental computer made Frank's heart break. Sterling wasn't just stealing Emma's mathematical abilities, he was systematically destroying everything that made her human. That night, Frank made contact with someone he'd hoped never to need, Tommy Marconi, a private investigator who had helped him navigate the legal system during his divorce. Tommy specialized in cases involving corporate malfeasance and had a reputation for finding evidence that powerful people preferred to keep hidden. "Jesus, Frank, you're talking about Richard Sterling," Tommy said, when Frank outlined the situation during a clandestine meeting in a Queens diner. "The man has more lawyers than the Pentagon. If even half of what you're telling me is true, you're not just risking your job, you're risking your life. They're going to kill my daughter, Tommy. Maybe not directly, but they're destroying who she is, turning her into some kind of human computer, and when they're done extracting what they want from her brain." Frank's voice broke. "The files I saw talked about subject retirement. I know what that means." Tommy studied Frank across the chipped Formica table, evaluating his desperation and finding it genuine. "Okay, but we're going to need evidence that would hold up in court, and we're going to need it fast. How much access do you have to Sterling's files?" "Enough, but if I get caught..." "If you get caught, Emma loses the only person fighting for her, so don't get caught." Over the next 3 days, Frank systematically copied every file related to Project Mathematical Savant. The deeper he dug into Sterling's private servers, the more horrifying the scope of the operation became. Emma wasn't Sterling's first attempt at cognitive replication. There had been others. Children identified for exceptional abilities in various fields, brought into similar educational programs, studied until their usefulness was exhausted. The fate of previous subjects was documented with clinical detachment. Some had been institutionalized when the psychological pressure of constant analysis broke their minds. Others had simply disappeared, their families relocated with generous financial settlements and strict non-disclosure agreements. None had been heard from again. But Emma was different. Emma's mathematical abilities exceeded anything Sterling had encountered before. The files showed she could potentially unlock artificial intelligence capabilities that would make Sterling Dynamics the most powerful corporation in human history. The stakes were too high for Sterling to simply discard her when the research was complete. According to the most recent project updates, Emma would be transferred to a specialized research facility in 6 weeks, an isolated laboratory in Montana, where her cognitive mapping could be completed without outside interference. Once there, she would never be allowed to leave. Frank realized that their window for escape was closing rapidly. But as he formulated increasingly desperate plans to flee with Emma, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. Sterling knew that Frank had been accessing the classified files. Security logs showed every keystroke, every document accessed, every moment Frank had spent uncovering the truth. Sterling had been letting Frank discover the truth about Project Mathematical Savant. The question that would determine their survival was why. What was Sterling's endgame? And was Frank walking directly into a trap designed to ensure he could never expose what Sterling Dynamics was really doing to gifted children? Frank arrived at work Monday morning to find Sterling waiting in his office, sitting calmly behind Frank's desk, like a king receiving a subject. The billionaire's expression was serene, almost amused, as he gestured for Frank to sit in the visitor's chair, a role reversal that made Frank's skin crawl with its obvious symbolism. "We need to talk," Sterling said simply. Frank's mouth went dry. He'd spent the weekend copying the final batch of classified files, documenting evidence of Sterling's crimes against children that stretched back over a decade. The flash drive containing everything was hidden in Emma's backpack, the one place Sterling's security wouldn't think to search. "About what, sir?" Sterling smiled with the patient tolerance of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "About your unauthorized access to classified corporate files. About your meeting with Tommy Marconi at the Moonlight Diner on Friday night. About your touching but ultimately futile plan to expose Project Mathematical Savant." Sterling leaned back in Frank's chair, completely relaxed. "Did you really think I wouldn't know?" The words hit Frank like physical blows. Sterling had been monitoring everything. Frank's computer access, his phone calls, probably even his conversations with Emma. They were trapped in a web so complete that Frank had been deluding himself to think escape was possible. "Frank, let me explain something about power," Sterling continued, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture. "True power isn't about money or influence or even fear. True power is about controlling the narrative, about making people choose between impossible options and convincing them they made the choice freely." Frank forced himself to remain calm, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted. Emma's cooperation in completing Project Mathematical Savant. But I've realized that forcing her cooperation would be inefficient. Traumatized subjects don't perform optimally, so I'm offering you a choice." Sterling pulled a tablet from his briefcase and placed it on the desk between them. The screen showed a bank account with Frank's name, containing a balance that made his vision blur. $25 million. "Option 1, Sterling said. "You sign a non-disclosure agreement, take Emma, and disappear. New identities, new lives, financial security for the rest of your days. Emma gets to grow up normally, attend regular schools, have a regular childhood. You both walk away from this situation and never speak of it again." Frank stared at the number on the screen. $25 million. Enough to give Emma any life she wanted, anywhere in the world. Enough to ensure she never had to worry about money, never had to watch her father work himself to death for their survival. "And option 2? Sterling's smile turned predatory. "You continue your heroic crusade to expose my crimes. You take your evidence to the FBI, the media, anyone who will listen. You fight the good fight against corporate corruption and the exploitation of gifted children." That doesn't sound like much of a choice. Oh, but it is. Because if you choose option 2, you'll discover that your evidence has been fabricated. Computer logs will show that you created the Project Mathematical Savant files yourself, a disgruntled employee attempting to extort money from his generous benefactor. Your claims will be dismissed as the desperate lies of a man facing embezzlement charges. Sterling leaned forward, his blue eyes holding the cold intensity of a predator closing in for the kill. "More importantly, Emma will be taken into protective custody while the charges against you are investigated. She'll be placed in a specialized facility for her own safety. Coincidentally, the same Montana laboratory I mentioned in those files you read. By the time your case is resolved and you're acquitted of charges that will mysteriously disappear, Emma will have completed her contribution to advancing human knowledge." The trap was perfect in its simplicity. Fight and lose everything while Sterling still got what he wanted. Surrender and save Emma, but allow Sterling to continue destroying other children. "You're asking me to let you get away with murder. I'm asking you to prioritize your daughter's welfare over abstract moral principles. Isn't that what good fathers do?" Sterling stood, smoothing his perfectly tailored suit. "You have 24 hours to decide, Frank. Choose wisely. Emma's future depends on it." As Sterling walked toward the door, he paused for one final comment that made Frank's blood freeze. "Oh, and Frank!" Emma's brain scans show that her mathematical abilities are beginning to plateau. We estimate she'll reach peak cognitive development within the next few weeks. After that, her usefulness to the project will be limited. Frank realized with growing horror that Sterling wasn't offering him a choice at all. Emma was going to be transferred to Montana regardless of what Frank decided. The only question was whether Frank would be alive to know what happened to her. The devil's bargain was simpler than Sterling had made it sound. Take the money and run, knowing Emma would disappear forever within weeks. or fight and watch Sterling destroy them both while still getting everything he wanted. But as Frank stared at the bank account balance that represented more money than he'd ever dreamed of having, he realized there might be a third option, one that Sterling's arrogance had prevented him from considering. Sometimes the only way to beat the devil was to become something worse than hell itself. Frank didn't go home that night. Instead, he drove to the one place in New York where he could think clearly, the cemetery in Queens where his mother was buried. Sitting on the cold marble bench beside her grave, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, he tried to find the courage for what he was about to do. "I don't know if you can hear me, Mom," he whispered to the headstone, "but I need help. I need to know how far a father should go to save his child." The answer came not in words, but in memory. His mother, working 3 jobs to keep him in school. His mother selling her wedding ring to pay for his college application fees. His mother fighting cancer for 8 months without health insurance because she'd spent everything on his education. She had sacrificed everything for his future. Now it was his turn. At 3 a.m., Frank used his keycard to enter Sterling Dynamics one last time, but instead of heading to the executive floors, he went to the building's mechanical systems, the infrastructure he knew better than anyone else in the building. For 15 years, he had maintained these systems, learned every pipe, every wire, every fail-safe that kept the massive corporate tower functioning. Frank wasn't going to expose Sterling's crimes. He wasn't going to take the money and run. He was going to do something that would ensure Sterling could never hurt another child again. He was going to destroy Sterling Dynamics from the inside. The plan was elegantly simple. Sterling Dynamics' most valuable asset wasn't money or equipment. It was data. Decades of research, government contracts, proprietary algorithms, financial records, and most importantly, all the evidence of Sterling's crimes against children. Everything was stored in the building's central server farm, protected by state-of-the-art security systems, but vulnerable to someone with Frank's knowledge of the building's infrastructure. Working with the methodical precision of someone who had nothing left to lose, Frank systematically disabled the server room's fire suppression systems, rerouted the electrical feeds to create an overload condition, and compromised the backup cooling systems. When the servers overheated in approximately 6 hours, they would trigger a cascade failure that would destroy every piece of data Sterling Dynamics had accumulated over 20 years. But Frank's real masterpiece was the timing. The catastrophic system failure would occur at exactly 9 a.m. during Sterling's weekly board meeting, when every executive and department head would be gathered in the main conference room. The building's fire safety systems would trigger an immediate evacuation, but the server destruction would be complete before anyone realized what was happening. Sterling would lose everything: his company, his research, his evidence against Frank, and most importantly, all records of Project Mathematical Savant and the children who had been destroyed by it. With his sabotage complete, Frank drove to Emma's school. It was 6 a.m., still dark, the building empty except for security guards who knew him from his Sterling Dynamics credentials. He found Emma in the special tutoring room, where she often spent early morning hours working on advanced mathematics, her small figure hunched over equations that would challenge NASA engineers. "Daddy?" Emma looked up, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Frank knelt beside her chair, taking her small hands in his. "Emma, we're going on a trip, right now. But I have my neural mapping session with Dr. Foster at 8. And my quantum mechanics tutorial at 10. No more sessions, baby, no more tests. We're going home." Emma's eyes, those brilliant blue eyes that saw mathematical truths other minds couldn't perceive, studied Frank with the analytical intensity that had made her so valuable to Sterling. "Something's wrong. Your heart rate is elevated, you're sweating despite the cool temperature, and your voice has the stress patterns you had when Mommy left." No, the clinical way Emma analyzed his emotional state made Frank's heart break. Sterling had turned his intuitive, empathetic daughter into a calculating machine that processed human feelings like mathematical equations. "Yes, something's wrong," Frank said softly. "But Daddy's going to fix it. Are you ready for an adventure?" Emma nodded, though Frank could see her struggling with the disruption to her carefully scheduled routine. Sterling's conditioning ran deep, but underneath the programmed responses, Frank's little girl was still there. They drove toward the airport as the sun rose over Manhattan, Frank's phone buzzing incessantly with calls from Sterling, Dr. Foster, and building security. Behind them, smoke was beginning to rise from the Sterling Dynamics Tower as the server room overheated and triggered the first wave of system failures. At 9:15 a.m., as their plane lifted off from JFK Airport, Frank received a final text message from Sterling. "You've destroyed everything, but it won't save her. I'll find you both." Frank deleted the message and turned off the phone. He looked at Emma, who was staring out the window at the receding city with an expression that seemed almost like relief. "Where are we going, Daddy?" "Somewhere safe. Somewhere they'll never find us." "And then what?" Frank smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in months. "Then you get to be a little girl again. Would you like that?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications with her extraordinary mind. When she finally answered, her voice carried a hint of the wonder that Sterling had tried so hard to eliminate. "I think I'd like that very much." But as their plane climbed toward cruising altitude, Frank knew their ordeal was far from over. Sterling had lost everything, but men like him didn't accept defeat. They would be hunted for the rest of their lives by someone with unlimited resources and nothing left to lose. The question that would determine their survival was simple. How long could a janitor and his daughter stay ahead of one of the most powerful men in America? And what would Frank be willing to sacrifice to keep Emma free? 3 months later, Frank and Emma lived in a small cabin outside Missoula, Montana, surrounded by wilderness that seemed a universe away from Manhattan's glass towers. Frank had used Sterling's money, ironically transferred before the building's destruction triggered the account freeze, to create new identities for them both. Emma Thompson had become Sophie Walsh, and Frank was now Michael Walsh, a widowed writer working on a novel about corporate corruption. Emma was slowly rediscovering childhood. She still solved complex mathematics in her head, but now she also collected wildflowers, built snow forts, and laughed at silly jokes with the uninhibited joy of a 7-year-old. The calculating machine Sterling had tried to create was giving way to the curious, empathetic child Frank remembered. On a Tuesday morning that dawned crisp and clear, Frank was teaching Emma to fish in the stream behind their cabin when he noticed the black SUV parked on the dirt road. His blood froze. After 3 months of carefully constructed anonymity, Sterling had found them. "Emma, go inside the cabin and pack your backpack with your favorite things." Quickly, Emma looked toward the SUV, her mathematical mind immediately calculating probabilities and outcomes. "It's him, isn't it? Mr. Sterling?" "Yes, baby. But don't worry. Daddy has a plan." But Frank's confidence was a mask over desperation. He'd always known this moment would come. Sterling had unlimited resources and unlimited motivation for revenge. Frank's destruction of Sterling Dynamics had cost the billionaire everything. His company had collapsed, government contracts had been cancelled, and the FBI was investigating the destroyed servers for evidence of the defense contractor fraud that Frank's sabotage had exposed. Sterling emerged from the SUV alone, which surprised Frank. The man looked haggard, older than his 42 years, his expensive suit rumpled and his silver hair unkempt. The billionaire CEO who had commanded boardrooms and intimidated senators now looked like exactly what he was, a broken man with nothing left to lose. "Hello, Frank," Sterling called across the clearing. "Or should I say Michael?" "You've led me quite a chase." Frank stepped between Sterling and the cabin, acutely aware that Emma was inside, gathering her things. "How did you find us?" "Mathematical patterns," Sterling replied with a bitter laugh. Emma's enrollment in the local school, her performance on state testing, the way she approaches problem-solving. "Genius leaves traces, Frank. Your daughter's mind is too distinctive to hide forever." "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted. Emma's cooperation in rebuilding what you destroyed." Sterling's voice carried the desperation of a man grasping at his last chance for redemption. "My company is gone, my reputation is ruined, my life's work erased. But Emma could restore everything. Her mathematical abilities could launch a new company, solve problems that would make us billions, create technologies that would change the world." "She's not your property, Sterling. She's a little girl who deserves to have a childhood." "She's wasted on childhood," Sterling exploded, his carefully controlled facade finally cracking completely. "Do you have any idea what she could accomplish? The problems she could solve, the advances in science, technology, medicine that her mind could unlock? You're condemning humanity to mediocrity because you want to play house with a walking mathematical revolution." Frank heard the cabin door open behind him and felt Emma's small hand slip into his. She had emerged despite his instructions, drawn by the confrontation and perhaps by something deeper, an understanding that this moment would define the rest of their lives. "Mr. Sterling," Emma said, her voice carrying a clarity that made both men stop arguing and stare at her. "May I ask you a question?" "Ask." Sterling knelt down to Emma's eye level, his desperation making him grasp at any opportunity for connection. "Of course, Emma. What would you like to know?" "If you could solve any mathematical problem in the universe, but solving it meant you could never hug anyone you loved ever again, would you do it?" The question hung in the mountain air like a riddle from an ancient oracle. Sterling stared at Emma, his brilliant mind working through the implications of her seemingly simple query. That's not how mathematics works, Emma. Knowledge doesn't require sacrificing human connection, doesn't it?" Emma tilted her head with the innocent curiosity that Sterling had tried so hard to eliminate. "You sacrificed your connection to your mother for 35 years to build your company. You wanted to sacrifice my connection to my daddy to use my brain. You think mathematics is more important than love." "Oh." Sterling's face went pale as Emma's words struck home. "Emma, it's not that simple." "It is that simple," Emma continued, her 7-year-old wisdom cutting through decades of Sterling's rationalizations. "You forgot the most important equation of all." "What equation?" Emma smiled, the pure, joyful smile of a child who had solved a puzzle that adults couldn't see. Love plus love equals more love. It's the only math problem where adding things together makes everything bigger instead of using things up. Before Sterling could respond, another voice cut through the morning air. "She's absolutely right." Margaret Sterling emerged from behind the SUV where she had apparently been waiting. Frank's heart sank. If Sterling had brought his mother as backup, their situation had become impossibly complicated. But Margaret's next words shattered Frank's assumptions. "Richard, it's time to stop." Sterling spun around, his face a mask of confusion and betrayal. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "What I should have done 35 years ago," Margaret said, her voice firm with maternal authority. "Protecting a child from someone who sees them as an object instead of a person." Frank watched in stunned silence as Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "Agent Harrison, this is Margaret Sterling. I'm calling to turn in my son for violations of federal laws regarding human experimentation and child endangerment. Yes, I have documentation. Everything." Sterling staggered backward as if physically struck. "You're turning me in, your own son." "I'm saving you," Margaret said softly, "just like Emma's father saved her. Because sometimes love means stopping the people we care about from destroying themselves and others." The sound of approaching helicopters filled the air. FBI agents would arrive within minutes to arrest Sterling for crimes that would put him in federal prison for the rest of his life. But as Frank watched the broken billionaire look at his daughter and his mother, he saw something unexpected in Sterling's eyes. Relief. "I lost myself, didn't I?" Sterling whispered, his voice breaking. "Somewhere along the way, I forgot what I was really trying to prove." Margaret knelt beside her son, taking his hands in hers. "You were trying to prove you were worthy of love, Richard. But you were always worthy. You just forgot how to see it." As the FBI helicopters landed and agents surrounded Sterling, Frank realized that the real victory wasn't escaping the billionaire's pursuit. The real victory was Emma, standing beside him, holding his hand, her mathematical genius intact, but her humanity restored. She had solved the equation that Sterling had spent his entire life trying to understand. The value of love could never be calculated, only experienced. 6 months later, Frank and Emma lived openly under their real names in a small Colorado town where Emma attended regular elementary school and Frank taught adult education classes at the community college. Emma still solved complex mathematical problems, but now she also played soccer, collected rocks, and read fairy tales with equal enthusiasm. They received occasional letters from Margaret Sterling, who visited her son in federal prison every week and reported that he was slowly rediscovering the man he had been before ambition consumed his soul. On Emma's 8th birthday, as they shared cake and watched the sunset paint the Colorado mountains in brilliant oranges and purples, Emma asked Frank a question that made him smile. "Daddy, do you think love is the most important discovery in the universe?" Frank hugged his daughter close, feeling the warmth of her small body against his chest and marveling at the miracle of getting to be her father. "I think love is what makes every other discovery worth making, sweetheart." Emma nodded seriously, then grinned with the uncontainable joy of childhood. "That's what I calculated too." As father and daughter watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Frank realized that the greatest mathematical truth wasn't written in equations or stored in computers. It was written in the simple arithmetic of everyday miracles. One father, plus one daughter, plus unconditional love equals everything that really matters in the universe. Some problems, Frank had learned, were too beautiful to solve. They were meant to be lived.